Chapter 1. The Fear of Death. Ilenia had never felt true fear in all her years as a Zarkari warrior. Her people were known for their cold, calculating nature and their ruthless efficiency in battle. Fear was something taught to the weaker species, the ones who couldn't hold their ground, the ones who crumbled under pressure. The Zarkari were different, forged in the fires of conflict, bred for dominance. But as she sat in the cold, metallic cell deep within the human outpost, shackled to the walls, she could feel it creeping into her bones, like a poison slowly spreading through her body. The cell was dimly lit, barely enough to see the edges of the room. The air was thick with the scent of blood, hers and others who had fallen before her. Her body was a patchwork of wounds, bruises forming along her arms, legs, and across her sharp-featured face. Each breath she took was a reminder of the battle she had lost, the crushing defeat at the hands of the humans, something that should never have happened. She had trained for decades, had slaughtered entire battalions with her elite squad. Humans were supposed to be weak, primitive even, despite their technological advancements. But this time, they had been ready. This time, she had underestimated them. She replayed the events in her mind, trying to understand how it had all gone wrong. They had approached the human outpost with precision, their orders clear. Eliminate all resistance and take control of the communications center. It was a strategic move by the Empire, one designed to cripple the humans' ability to coordinate their defenses in this sector. It should have been simple. It should have been a massacre in favor of the Zarkari. But it wasn't. The human resistance had been fierce, far more organized than expected. They had utilized weapons and tactics Ilenia had never encountered before, blending technology with raw brutality in a way that made her spine tingle. Her squad had been decimated, and in the chaos, she had been taken prisoner. Something that rarely happened to a warrior of her caliber. Captured, broken, humiliated. She expected no mercy, especially from a human. They had a reputation for being vengeful, for relishing in the suffering of their enemies. The galaxy was filled with stories of their cruelty, of how they showed no pity to those who dared oppose them. As a high-ranking Zarkari officer, she knew her fate would be no different. Her death would be slow, painful, an example to any other Zarkari who thought to challenge human supremacy. And yet, as the door to her cell slid open, and the shadow of her captor fell across the cold floor, she still hoped that it would be quick. The man who entered was tall, his muscular frame outlined by the dim light. His skin was a shade of warm bronze, and his eyes, piercing and intense, were a deep green that seemed to shimmer in the low light. His uniform was battle-worn, the insignia of the Terran Federation emblazoned on his chest. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place, calculating, but not cold. As he stepped closer, his boots echoing against the metal floor, Ilenia tensed, preparing herself for whatever fate awaited her. "You're Ilenia, aren't you?" His voice was deeper than she expected, with a calm that unnerved her. She didn't respond, glaring at him instead, her violet eyes narrowing. What was the point of answering? She was just a prisoner, nothing more than a broken warrior now at his mercy. He could do whatever he wanted to her: torture, kill, degrade. She would endure it all with the stoicism of a Zarkari, even if it meant her end. The human soldier crouched in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched into his face, the roughness of his stubble from days of combat without rest. He was young, likely only a few years into his service, but there was a darkness behind his eyes, the weight of having seen too much, of having survived too many battles. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You don't have to die here, you know." His words hung in the air, confusing her for a brief moment. Ilenia's instincts screamed at her not to trust him. Humans were masters of manipulation, known for their cunning and deceit. She knew better than to believe anything he said, yet there was something in his tone, something that lacked the venom she expected. Still, she remained silent, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of a response. "You're a high-ranking officer," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "The Federation doesn't kill prisoners of war unless absolutely necessary. We're not monsters." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, though it pained her to do so. "Not monsters," she rasped, her voice hoarse from days of dehydration and lack of sleep. "You slaughtered my entire squad. You call that mercy?" The human sighed, a sound that surprised her. She expected arrogance, mockery, not regret. You attacked us first. You were going to kill every one of us. What did you expect? His voice grew harder now, tinged with frustration. I don't know what kind of propaganda your empire feeds you, but humans don't enjoy killing. We do it because we have to. Because if we don't, people like you wipe us out. Eilenia's jaw clenched as his words sank in. She hated it, hated that there was a part of her that understood his point. She had been trained her entire life to view humans as the enemy, as inferior beings standing in the way of Zarkari dominance. And yet, sitting here now, bruised and broken, she couldn't help but question the endless cycle of violence between their species. She swallowed hard, refusing to let herself be swayed by this soldier's strange empathy. What do you want from me? She spat, her defiance returning despite the pain racking her body. Why keep me alive? The human stood, pacing slightly as if choosing his words carefully. I want answers. I want to know why your people keep coming after us, why you can't leave us in peace. We were content staying on our side of the galaxy, and then you show up, declaring war. Why? Eilenia blinked in surprise. Of all the things she expected, this was not it. Was he serious? Did he truly not understand? The Zarkari don't leave things unfinished, she replied, her voice steadying. Your people showed strength when you should have fallen. Our empire doesn't tolerate defiance. You're an anomaly, one we were sent to correct. The human soldier stopped, his eyes locking onto hers once again. So it's just about power? Control? Survival, she corrected him, her voice hardening. It's always about survival. Your existence is a threat to ours, and threats must be eliminated. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of their species' conflict hanging between them like an invisible barrier. Eilenia could see the gears turning in the human's mind, could see that he was wrestling with something far more complicated than simple hatred. But whatever thoughts plagued him, he kept them to himself. Finally, he stepped closer again, his face mere inches from hers. Eilenia tensed, her heart pounding in her chest, expecting violence, expecting pain. But instead, he reached out, his hand brushing a lock of her silver hair from her bruised face. The gentleness of the gesture shocked her to her core. Eilenia, he said softly, almost like a whisper, you don't have to die today. Her breath caught in her throat, confusion swirling within her. What was he playing at? Why wasn't he killing her? Or at the very least, why wasn't he torturing her for information? Before she could speak, before she could demand an explanation, he turned and walked toward the door. As it slid open, he glanced back over his shoulder. Think about what I said, he murmured. You have more control over your fate than you think. With that, he was gone, leaving Eilenia alone in the cold darkness of her cell, her mind racing with questions she never thought she'd have to ask. Chapter 2. The Plea for Escape. Eilenia lay in her cold cell for hours, her body aching from the bruises and the chains that bound her wrists and ankles. Despite the discomfort, her thoughts drifted back to the strange encounter with the human soldier. He had confused her in a way that no opponent had ever done before. It wasn't just his decision not to kill her. It was the gentleness in his voice, the way he spoke to her as if she were more than just an enemy combatant. The way he didn't see her as a prisoner to be tormented, but as someone who could still make a choice. She wanted to hate him, wanted to keep seeing him as nothing more than a ruthless killer, a symbol of humanity's rise that threatened the Zarkari Empire. But his words wouldn't leave her mind. Why didn't he kill her? And why had he said that she had control over her fate? For the Zarkari, fate was a rigid concept. Her life had been decided the moment she was born, raised to fight, to serve the Empire, and to die if necessary. There were no deviations from that path, no questioning of the system. Yet here she was, locked in a cage, pondering whether her fate was as predetermined as she had always believed. The idea was almost laughable to her, but deep down, there was something in his words that resonated. The door to her cell slid open again with a soft hiss, and this time, Eilenia forced herself to sit up, grimacing at the pain in her muscles. She expected another guard or perhaps a medic to check on her wounds, but when the figure stepped into the dim light, her heart skipped a beat. It was him again, the human soldier from earlier. Back for more, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. though she was far from feeling confident. He ignored her tone and approached her with the same calm demeanor as before. He crouched down in front of her again, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand something that was beyond the comprehension of either of their species. "You're still alive," he observed, his voice soft but firm. "Isn't that the point of keeping me in here?" Alenia snapped, her temper flaring slightly. "To toy with me until you decide I've outlived my usefulness?" The soldier sighed, a sound she found oddly familiar now. "I told you before, we don't kill prisoners unless we have to. You're valuable." Valuable. The word stung her pride. As a warrior, she was supposed to be feared, not kept alive like some tool for a human to use. She pulled at her restraints, her frustration rising. "Valuable how?" she growled. "You've already won. You don't need me." He remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady on her. Then he reached into his uniform and pulled out a small data pad, showing her the screen. Alenia's eyes widened as she saw the image. It was a map of Zarkari territory, overlaid with human reconnaissance data. Her mind raced. They had gotten that close to Zarkari strongholds? "You know the layout of these bases better than anyone," he said calmly. "You can help us prevent more bloodshed." Her lip curled in disgust. "You want me to betray my people?" The human's expression didn't change. "I want you to help stop this war." Alenia's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't a fool. She knew the implications of his offer. If she gave the humans strategic information about Zarkari bases, she would be labeled a traitor, a coward unworthy of the Empire's respect. It would be a death sentence if not at the hands of the humans, then by her own people should she ever return. But something about the way he framed it made her pause. He wasn't asking for conquest, wasn't demanding she give them victory. He was asking for peace. "I'd rather die here than sell out my own," she said, but there was less venom in her voice this time, as if she was still processing the weight of his words. The human shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't have to sell out anyone. We're not asking you to be a spy. Just help us find a way to end this without more killing." Alenia blinked in confusion. She had expected humans to demand dominance, to crush their enemies at every turn. But this one spoke of peace. Was this how all humans thought, or was he different? She studied him more carefully now, trying to understand his motives. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly, her curiosity overcoming her defiance. The human hesitated for a moment before answering. "Nathan," he said. "Nathan Carter." Alenia let the name roll around in her mind, trying to reconcile this man's compassion with the image she had of humanity as a whole. "Nathan," she repeated softly, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. Nathan shifted his weight slightly, glancing at the restraints that bound her. "Alenia, I don't want to see you die here. But if you're not willing to talk, we'll have to transfer you to a more secure facility. I doubt you'll get the same treatment there." Her stomach clenched at the thought. She had heard stories of what happened to prisoners in the Federation's more secretive locations, places where they weren't so concerned with following protocol, where they would extract information by any means necessary. The idea of being subjected to such horrors made her skin crawl. "And what do I get if I help you?" she asked, trying to sound disinterested even as fear gnawed at her insides. Nathan stood up, crossing his arms over his chest. "A chance to live. We can work out some sort of agreement. Maybe even get you back to your people eventually. But only if you cooperate." Alenia's mind raced. Could she trust him? Could she really believe that a human would keep his word, that he wouldn't just use her and then discard her when she was no longer useful? And yet, what other choice did she have? If she refused, she would likely be transferred and subjected to far worse treatment. If she agreed, at least she could buy herself more time, perhaps even find a way to escape. Her silence must have told Nathan that she was wavering, because he leaned down again, his eyes softening slightly. "Alenia, I know this is difficult, but this war doesn't have to end with more bodies piling up. You can make a difference." His voice was so earnest, so full of conviction, that it caught her off guard. For a moment, she saw something in him that she had never seen in any human before: hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from clinging to life in the face of danger, but the quiet hope that believes in a better future, even in the midst of war. Alenia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Nathan nodded, clearly understanding the weight of her words. "That's all I'm asking for right now. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before it opened. You'll have some time to rest. I'll come back tomorrow to check on you. But don't take too long to decide. We don't have much time left before the next offensive. With that, he left, the door sliding shut behind him. Eilenia was alone once more, but this time, her mind was racing with possibilities she hadn't considered before. She leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling of her cell. Could she really trust this human? Could she believe in his talk of peace, of ending the war? Or was this just another human tactic, a way to manipulate her into giving them what they wanted? Her mind spun with conflicting thoughts, but one thing was clear: Nathan Carter was not like the other humans she had encountered, and that made him dangerous in a way she had never anticipated. Chapter 3. An Unexpected Bond. Eilenia awoke with a start, the cold of her cell seeping deep into her bones. Her body ached, but it was nothing compared to the confusion swirling in her mind. Nathan's words still lingered, tugging at her thoughts. She had tried to block it all out, to steel herself against the human's unexpected kindness, but it was no use. His offer wasn't just a simple proposition, it was a disruption of everything she believed in. The idea that she had a choice, that she could somehow help stop the war, felt ludicrous. And yet, he hadn't tortured her, hadn't tried to extract information through pain. Instead, he had given her space to think, a courtesy no enemy had ever granted her before. She shifted slightly, her wrists chafing against the metal cuffs. Her mind was racing through possibilities, none of them favorable. Cooperation meant betrayal, and betrayal was something the Zarkari would never forgive. But she also knew what awaited her if she refused to speak a fate worse than death in a Federation prison designed for high-level prisoners like her. As she pondered her limited options, the door to her cell opened once again, and Nathan stepped inside. This time, his presence didn't surprise her. If anything, she had been expecting him, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps a part of her had wanted him to return, to continue their strange, unsettling conversation. He stood before her, hands clasped behind his back, and gave her a nod of acknowledgement. There was no smugness, no arrogance in his posture, only a calm patience that she found unnerving. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She stared at him for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. The idea that he cared about her well-being, even if it was just a facade, was something she had never expected. "I'm alive," she muttered, her voice harsher than she intended. Nathan gave a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's good to hear." He approached slowly, kneeling in front of her again, just as he had before. His proximity still made her tense, but not out of fear this time. There was something about him, an unspoken understanding that confused her more than anything else. "Eilenia," he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers. "I know you're conflicted. I can see it in your eyes." Her lip curled, and she let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can read me, human?" Nathan didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he sighed, leaning back slightly as he considered his next words. "No, I don't claim to know what you're going through. I can't. But I've been a soldier long enough to recognize the look of someone who's torn between loyalty and survival." Eilenia clenched her jaw, turning her head away. She hated that he was right, hated that his words pierced through the walls she had built up over the years. Her loyalty to the Zarkari Empire was absolute, or at least it had been. But now, after everything she had witnessed, after seeing the horrors of war firsthand, she wasn't so sure. What was the point of loyalty if it led to endless bloodshed? What was the point of serving an empire that would throw her life away without a second thought? Nathan's voice was quiet when he spoke again. "I wasn't always a soldier, you know." That caught her attention. She glanced back at him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, and what were you before? A diplomat? A scientist?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, I was an engineer. I fixed things, built things. The military wasn't my first choice, but when the war broke out, I didn't really have a choice. None of us did." Eilenia's eyes narrowed, trying to discern whether he was telling the truth. "An engineer," she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. "And now you're here, capturing prisoners and fighting wars." Nathan shrugged, his expression turning somber. "War changes people. It makes you do things you never thought you'd do." She could feel the weight behind his words, the quiet pain that lingered in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about himself, he was talking about her, about every soldier who had ever been caught in the tide of war. For a moment, the tension between them eased. The barrier of enmity that had defined their relationship began to crumble, if only slightly. She saw him, not as the enemy, but as someone who had been forced into this conflict just as she had. It was an uncomfortable realization, one that she didn't know how to process. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan leaned forward, his green eyes boring into hers with a sincerity that left her breathless. "Because I want you to understand that it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to die for a cause that doesn't care about you. You don't have to be another casualty in a war that no one truly wants." Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the familiar sting of tears welling in her eyes. She blinked them back, refusing to show weakness in front of him, but his words cut deeper than she cared to admit. The Zarkari had always been taught that dying for the Empire was the highest honor, but now, as she sat here, bound and broken, she questioned whether that was true. What honor was there in dying alone in a prison cell, far from home, for an empire that wouldn't even remember her name? "I can't betray my people," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't." Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "I'm not asking you to betray anyone. I'm asking you to help us find a way out of this mess. If we keep going like this, more people, human and Zarkari alike, will die. And for what? What will either of our species gain from this war?" Her breath hitched as his words hit home. She had never thought of it that way before. The Zarkari were always focused on conquest, on expanding their empire, on eliminating threats. But in the end, what did they gain from it? More territory? More resources? At what cost? Her mind was spinning, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She didn't know what to think, didn't know what to believe anymore. All she knew was that Nathan's words stirred something inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future where she wasn't just another casualty in a never-ending war. A future where peace was possible, where she could live without the weight of the Empire's expectations crushing her every step. Nathan must have sensed her hesitation, because he reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. The touch was warm, and for a brief moment, it grounded her in the present, pulling her away from the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. "You're not alone in this, Ilenia," he said softly. "We can figure this out together." Her gaze flickered to his hand on her arm, and she felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She had never been touched like this before, not with kindness, not with understanding. It was a foreign sensation, one that both confused and comforted her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. The chains around her wrists and ankles no longer felt as heavy, and the cold of the cell seemed less biting. For the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or anger. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Nathan's hand lingered on her arm for a moment longer before he pulled back, his expression soft. "Because I believe in a future where we don't have to kill each other. And I believe you do too." Her heart clenched at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was right. Chapter 4. The Decision. Ilenia lay awake in her cell that night, unable to sleep. Nathan's words haunted her, echoing in her mind as she struggled to make sense of everything. His offer hung in the air, a lifeline she wasn't sure she was ready to grasp. Could she truly turn her back on everything she had been taught? Could she trust this human, this enemy who had shown her nothing but kindness and understanding? And more importantly, could she trust herself? For hours, she wrestled with the decision, torn between loyalty to the Empire and the desire for something more. She thought of her comrades, of the Zarkari who had fought and died beside her, and the weight of their sacrifices pressed down on her chest. But she also thought of the endless cycle of violence, the bloodshed that had consumed both their species for far too long. In the end, she knew there was only one choice. The next morning, when Nathan entered her cell, she was ready. "I'll help you," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But on one condition." Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. "And what's that?" Ilenia took a deep breath, her violet eyes locking onto his. "When this is over, you let me go. No more chains, no more cells. I want my freedom." Chapter 4. The Decision. Ilenia lay awake in her cell that night, her thoughts spinning endlessly as she replayed the events of the past few days. The cold, hard floor beneath her did nothing to soothe her aching muscles or her troubled mind. She was used to hardship battle, wounds, and even death. But this was something she had never experienced. Confusion, doubt, hope. The chains around her wrists and ankles no longer felt as restrictive as before, but they still reminded her of her captivity. Yet, for the first time since her capture, she felt a different kind of tension gnawing at her, one that had nothing to do with her physical restraints and everything to do with the decision that lay before her. Nathan had given her a choice. A choice. It was such an alien concept to her. In the Zarkari Empire, choices were rare. Your fate was determined by your rank, by the needs of the Empire, by the battles you fought. You followed orders, and you did not question them. But Nathan, a human of all things, had shown her another path. He had offered her something she hadn't realized she craved. The possibility of a different future. As she lay there in the darkness, she tried to reconcile the soldier in her with the woman she had become. Was it really betrayal to seek peace? Could she truly abandon everything she had fought for? All the comrades she had lost, in pursuit of something that seemed so intangible? Her mind raced, flashing back to the countless battles she had fought. She had seen entire worlds burned to ash, civilizations crushed beneath the weight of the Empire's iron fist. She had been taught that it was necessary, that the Zarkari needed to assert their dominance to survive. And yet, now she questioned it all. Was survival really worth this endless cycle of death and destruction? What if there was another way? Nathan's words echoed in her mind. "We can figure this out together." Could she trust him? Could she really believe that a human species she had been trained to hate and fear wanted peace as much as he claimed? The thought gnawed at her, but deep down, she couldn't deny the truth. Nathan was different. He wasn't like the others she had fought. There was no malice in his eyes, no desire for conquest or dominance. He had shown her compassion, understanding, even when he had every reason to treat her as nothing more than an enemy. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the metal cuff around her wrist as she thought. He had touched her too gently, without force or cruelty. It was such a small thing, but it had stayed with her. His touch had been warm, human, and it had stirred something in her that she hadn't expected. Something that scared her more than any battle ever had. Time passed slowly, the hours blending together as she wrestled with her thoughts. She knew what the Empire would expect of her: silence, defiance, loyalty to the end. But for what? To die in a cell, or worse, to be tortured and broken for information she could never give? And what would that achieve? More bloodshed, more loss, more senseless death. No, she couldn't do it. She couldn't keep fighting for a cause that no longer made sense to her. She wasn't even sure if it ever had. The sound of footsteps approaching her cell door snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she sat up, the familiar tension of battle creeping into her muscles. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a decision. Her decision. The door slid open, and Nathan stepped inside. His presence, as always, was calm, steady. He looked at her with the same intensity as before, but there was something else in his gaze now, an understanding, a quiet patience. "Ilenia," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Have you made your decision?" She took a deep breath, the weight of her choice pressing down on her like a physical force. For a moment, she hesitated, her mind flickering with doubt. But then she looked into Nathan's eyes, and the doubt melted away. There was no turning back now. She had already made her choice. "I'll help you," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. "But I have a condition." Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression curious but cautious. "Go on." She swallowed, the words thick in her throat. "When this is over, when you've gotten what you need, you let me go. No more chains, no more cells. I want my freedom." Nathan studied her for a moment, his green eyes unreadable. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, could see him weighing her request. For a brief second, she wondered if he would refuse, If all of this had been a cruel game to manipulate her into cooperation. But then, he nodded slowly. "You have my word," he said, his voice firm but sincere. "When this is over, you'll be free to go." Relief flooded through her, though she tried not to show it. She had expected a fight, expected resistance. But Nathan's agreement came with no hesitation, no hidden agenda. He was being truthful, and that scared her even more. The sincerity in his eyes, the way he treated her with respect, was disarming in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Nathan's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that might have been relief on his face. "You don't have to thank me. I just want this war to end." She nodded, though the enormity of what she was agreeing to weighed heavily on her. She was making a choice not just for herself, but for the fate of countless others. If she provided the information Nathan needed, it could end the war, but it could also spell the end of the Zarkari Empire as she knew it. Was she ready to bear that responsibility? As if sensing her inner turmoil, Nathan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch once again grounded her, reminding her that she wasn't making this decision alone. He was offering her something more than just freedom. He was offering her a chance at redemption. "We'll make this right," Nathan said softly. "Together." The weight of his words hung between them, and for a moment, she felt something stir deep within her, a spark of hope, fragile but real. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. A future where she wasn't bound by the chains of war, where she could be something more than just a soldier. Nathan stood up, giving her a small nod before turning to leave. "I'll make the arrangements. It won't be easy, but I'll get you out of here soon. Just hold on a little longer." As the door slid shut behind him, Eilenia leaned back against the wall, her heart still racing. She had made her decision, but the path ahead was far from clear. There were still so many unknowns, so many dangers. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that there was a future beyond the war. Hope that she could carve out a new life for herself, free from the Empire's chains. And, most terrifying of all, hope that Nathan's kindness wasn't just a fleeting moment, but the start of something far deeper. Eilenia sat in the dim light of her cell, waiting. The decision had been made, and now there was no going back. The tension in the air was thick, and her mind buzzed with anticipation and fear. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a say in it.